Hi and welcome to the Swedish Tankmuseum. Today we have a guest, Mr. Hilary Louis Doyle from Ireland, and the plan is to talk a bit about tank development and details, and you would like to talk a bit about the Swedish vehicles and their influences on the rest of the world.
Yes.
Which might be a bit fascinating.
Yep. Well, I mean, first of all, I think when you're studying German vehicles, if you don't understand what was going on in Sweden, you're missing out on a very important chapter in the development of these vehicles. And we could start by looking at the fact that the Swedish army bought 10 of the First World War LK2 tanks from Germany after the war, so that was an influence, but in reverse. What we then see is by the mid-30s, quite a bit of influence. We see Maybach supplying engines for Swedish tank developments. We also see Landsverk developing some very important suspension components, and we see Bussing and AG supplying the chassis for the Landsverk armoured cars and the engines for the M38 light tanks. So these are very important influences, and we can look at each of these in turn to see what impact they had on in the future in the vehicles.
Mm-hmm. So where would you like to start?
Well, maybe since we're close by the Landsverk M10 wheel come track, we could take a quick look at that, because there's a very important engine in there. Well, I'm bringing people to look at this perhaps strange vehicle, the M31, because what we have here is an early attempt to solve the problem of how to move a tracked vehicle on the road. Everybody knew that tracks were very good cross-country, but to get a vehicle from one place to the other without destroying and wearing out the tracks, they came up with this solution of wheel-come-track, where you could lower the inflatable tires onto the road and drive the vehicle rather quickly. But the connection to the people who are interested in German vehicles, I think, is when we move towards the rear of the vehicle, because over here we are going to see a very familiar shape to the engine compartment, the sloped rear and the motor here, because in there is a Maybach V12 DSO-8 engine, which was the most powerful V12 petrol engine available in the mid-30s. This same engine was used to power the German 12-ton half-tracks, which were used both for artillery towing and as recovery vehicles, and is very important in the history of more German equipment, which we'll talk about a little bit later on. And I think it's quite fascinating to see how this influence in Sweden is affecting what's going on in Germany later on. The configuration of wheel-come-track, people interested in German armour will recognise that also for the SDKFZ 254, which was the observation vehicle based on an Austrian chassis, but the same idea of wheels that could be lowered for high-speed travel and tracks for rough country. The M38 Landsverk, this is very important from a German point of view, because within that a number of ideas are actually being tried out for the first time. The countries that had the M38s would be my own country, Ireland, had some, and the Hungarians built them under license as the Toldi. But the significant thing from a future development point of view was that these vehicles had torsion bar suspension. Not only had they got a single torsion bar across the vehicle, but they also had a double torsion bar, so the springing load is transferred across the torsion bar and back again, which doubles the length of the torsion bar and gives a very flexible and very smooth ride to the vehicle. And people who are only interested in German vehicles will perhaps think ahead and realize that this is what the suspension for the Panther and the Jagdpanther that's how they got the smooth ride in those particular vehicles. Yeah, the overall suspension and track layout is almost the same as you get on most of the German tanks, with the front wheel drive and the rear idler with the engine in the rear. And while this Swedish M38 has a Swedish engine in it, what's interesting to note is that the Irish ones had a Bussing and a Gay engine, which was the same engine that you get in an 8-wheeled armoured car, and the Hungarian Toldis also had the V8 engine that you had in the 8-wheeled armoured cars. So that's a connection to German vehicles. Yeah, so to look a little bit closer at the suspension, we have a torsion bar starts here, goes to the other side of the vehicle, and then is through a connector brought back to this side of the vehicle. So you get a double-length torsion bar, which gave a tremendously soft springing, and is the system that was used for the Panther at a later stage. What also is very interesting is that even at this stage, the Swedish vehicle has the armour is sloped inwards, which you don't get again on a German vehicle until we see it on the Jagdpanzer 38.
You had some thing to say about the Swedish connection to Germany.
Yes, well, the Landsverk company was actually a distant subsidiary of the MAN company. There was Gutterhütte in between, but that commanded the whole activity. So the engineers that were in Landsverk were also talking to their colleagues in MAN. So many of the ideas really came out when MAN finally got the contract to develop the Panther. And we see especially that double torsion bar arrangement in particular, but many other small features came from one side to the other. And it's important to note that even today, the connection has come in reverse, in that MAN is now responsible for Scania. So the truck business, which was MAN's main business, and the diesel engine development, that's all a connection now.
Yeah, and the history comes back again, yes, with a connection exactly. With another country.
Yes.
Speaking about diesel engine, why did Germany not? They had the technology for diesel engines, but
oh yes, excellent.
Why didn't they go more into diesel engine than they did?
Yeah,
why petrol?
Yeah, I mean, obviously diesel was invented in Germany, but they made a decision very early in the 30s that it would be simpler to have one type of fuel for the army. And the influences at the time, I'm not quite sure, but they decided it would be simpler to have petrol, gasoline as the main fuel. And also there was an influence from the fact that they knew they could produce gasoline from coal. So they had a very advanced scientific system for producing artificial gasoline, and that was of interest, that they wouldn't be totally dependent. Now, obviously, that calculation later on could be questioned because of the vast amounts they needed, but when they were first looking at this in the 30s, it seemed like they could produce adequate supplies for their own needs, and therefore diesel wasn't so important. But they did continue diesel development. MAN in particular had a range of very sophisticated diesel engines that could be mixed and matched, so that you could have a 6-cylinder diesel straight 6. The same engine basically put into a V configuration gave you a 12-cylinder engine, and so on. And that development continued ever so slowly, and MAN always continued to produce diesel trucks, which were very successful. And of course, before the war, we had the perhaps the most iconic of the German trucks, the Einheitsdiesel, which was a diesel truck, very successful, very powerful, very capable of pulling loads of such as artillery pieces and so forth, but a complex and expensive vehicle. So that was eventually phased out in favour of cheap petrol-driven trucks like the well, the mass-produced Opel Blitz, which every company was forced to manufacture. So the whole question of fuel is an issue. Later in the war, they began to take more and more interest in the diesel engines, and the diesel was about to become very important again because they had made a decision to standardize on the Tatra air-cooled diesel, which in its most popular form was the 12-cylinder diesel engine, and that would have been used for the Jagdpanzer 38s, 38Ds and so forth, and for the 8-wheeler armoured cars, the 234 armoured car series.
So the technology to make petrol out of coal was something they already knew before they had they needed to do it during the war. When the supplies of petrol were shortage, they could continue.
It was just simply a decision that would simplify the fuel supply logistics issue of how to get fuel to the troops, what type of engines to use, and so forth. So,
thank you very much.
Good, thank you.